I remember the exact sound those folding chairs made that evening, a metallic protest against the concrete floor of the church basement, each creak echoing off walls painted the color of old teeth. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with an electrical persistence that seemed to vibrate in my chest. 23 people scattered across the room, some hunched over scripts, others adjusting costumes that still smelled faintly of mothballs from last year's Christmas pageant. I sat in the third row, turning my wedding ring around my finger in slow, unconscious circles. The gold had worn smooth after 15 years of marriage, and the gesture had become as automatic as breathing. I was background, really, a voice in the crowd, a face among the disciples. Nothing more than a warm body to fill space during the crucifixion scene. I told myself I was fine with that. I had always been fine with being unremarkable. The director, Mrs. Patterson, clapped her hands twice to gather our attention. She explained that we would be running through the Garden of Gethsemane sequence, where several of us would portray the disciples keeping watch. That was when I first noticed him properly, Julian. He had joined the cast only 2 weeks prior, but somehow the light seemed to bend toward him differently. He sat 4 chairs away from me, one leg crossed over the other, reading his script with the kind of focus I envied. When Mrs. Patterson called our names for the scene, I felt my stomach tighten unexpectedly. Julian and I were partnered as companions, disciples who would share worried glances and whispered prayers while Christ suffered nearby. Simple enough. We were meant to convey friendship, brotherhood, the weight of witnessing something beyond our understanding. I walked to the makeshift stage area marked by blue painter's tape on the floor. Julian approached from the other side, and for the first time that evening, we stood close enough to see each other clearly. He was younger than me, though not by much, perhaps early 30s. His hair caught the harsh basement light in a way that made it look almost auburn. When he extended his hand to introduce himself properly, his grip was warm and steady. We took our positions. The scene was meant to be solemn, reverent. I had read through my lines dozens of times at home, sitting at the kitchen table while Evelyn washed dishes and Clara practiced piano in the next room. But standing there, facing Julian as Mrs. Patterson called for action, something shifted. He looked at me with an intensity that felt like recognition, as though we had shared more than just 2 brief conversations about blocking and costume fittings. His eyes were darker than I had noticed before, and when he delivered his first line about staying awake through the long night, his voice carried a weight that seemed meant specifically for me. I responded with my own line, something about fear and faith, but the words felt different in my mouth. The basement around us seemed to fade, the scattered chairs, the other actors, even Mrs. Patterson with her clipboard and her patient corrections. There was only Julian's face, the way he held his breath between lines, the slight tilt of his head as he listened to me speak. The silence that followed our exchange stretched longer than it should have. I became acutely aware of my heartbeat, of the warmth spreading beneath my collar. Someone coughed near the back of the room. A chair squeaked. Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Cut," she said. "Very nice, you too." That felt genuine. I looked away quickly, my cheeks burning with something I could not name. Julian stepped back, but not before I caught the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Not the polite, church-appropriate smile I was used to seeing, but something smaller, more private. Something that felt like a secret shared between us. The rest of rehearsal passed in a blur of blocking adjustments and script notes. I went through the motions, but my attention kept drifting to Julian. The way he moved through space with an ease I had never possessed. The way he listened when others spoke, tilting his head slightly to the left. The way he seemed comfortable in his own skin in a manner that felt almost foreign to me. That night, I drove home through streets I had traveled for over a decade, past the same houses with their same porch lights, their same well-maintained lawns. But everything felt different somehow, as though the world had shifted slightly off its axis. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to understand what had happened in that basement. Inside, Evelyn was already in bed, reading a novel with a bookmark marking her place exactly 3/4 through. She asked how rehearsal went. I told her it was fine, just fine." She nodded and returned to her book, and I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth and prepare for bed. It was then, standing before the mirror with its familiar reflection, thinning hair, lines around my eyes that seemed deeper each year, a face that had long ago settled into patterns of politeness and resignation, that I did something I had never done before. I removed my wedding ring before stepping into the shower. I could not explain why. The action felt both monumental and insignificant, like crossing a line I had not known existed. I set the ring on the counter next to my toothbrush and stared at it for a long moment. The pale band of skin where it usually rested looked naked, vulnerable, foreign. The hot water ran over my shoulders as I tried to make sense of what I was feeling. But words failed me then, just as they had failed me in that basement when Julian looked at me with those dark, knowing eyes. All I knew was that something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible, and I was not sure I was ready for what came next. The morning after that first rehearsal, I woke to the same routine that had governed my days for years. Evelyn was already up, moving through the kitchen with the efficient grace of someone who had long ago mapped out the most economical path between coffee maker, refrigerator, and breakfast table. She handed me my mug, the blue one with the small chip on the handle that I had grown fond of, and kissed my cheek with the same gentle pressure she had used for 15 years. Our house reflected the careful architecture of our marriage. Every surface held its designated purpose. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece in perfect symmetry. Our wedding day, Clara's first steps, vacation pictures from places we had visited but never truly seen. The refrigerator door displayed a calendar thick with appointments, dental cleanings, parent-teacher conferences, church committee meetings, Clara's violin lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays. A life measured in obligations, each square filled with the evidence of our participation in the world. Clara bounded down the stairs with 13-year-old energy, her school uniform already wrinkled despite having been pressed the night before. She talked about an upcoming science project while spooning cereal into her mouth, her words tumbling over each other with an enthusiasm I envied. I nodded and asked appropriate questions, playing the role of the engaged father. But even as I watched her animated gestures, I felt that familiar distance, as though I were observing her through glass, present but somehow separate. Evelyn reminded me about the church potluck on Sunday, about Clara's recital the following week, about the lawn mower that needed repair. I absorbed these details with the same attention I gave to everything else in our household, dutiful, thorough, but curiously detached. It was not unhappiness, exactly. It was more like living in a carefully constructed replica of a life, beautiful and functional, but somehow not quite real. I drove to work through streets that had become as automatic as breathing. The insurance office where I had spent the last 12 years sat in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a pharmacy, its windows offering a view of the parking lot and the steady stream of ordinary cars carrying ordinary people to their ordinary destinations. My desk occupied a corner of the main floor, close enough to the window to catch natural light, but far enough from the break room to avoid most casual conversations. My colleagues knew me as reliable, punctual, agreeable. During lunch, they gathered around Sandra's desk to share stories about their weekends, their children's accomplishments, their vacation plans. I usually ate at my desk, scanning case files or reading articles on my computer, content to remain at the periphery of their camaraderie. It was not that I disliked them. They were decent people living decent lives, but I had never learned the art of casual intimacy, the easy exchange of personal details that seemed to come so naturally to others. The hours passed with the steady rhythm of routine tasks. Claims to process, forms to review, phone calls to make. I was good at my job in the way that reliable people are good at things. Thorough, careful, unremarkable. I solved problems without drama, met deadlines without fanfare, earned my modest salary without aspiration for anything more. It was, I told myself, enough. But as the afternoon wore on, I found my thoughts drifting to the evening ahead. Tuesday meant rehearsal, which meant returning to that basement with its fluorescent lighting and metal chairs, its atmosphere of controlled chaos and shared purpose. It meant seeing Julian again, I had replayed our scene from the previous evening more times than I cared to admit. The way he had looked at me, the steadiness of his gaze, the moment when the rest of the room seemed to disappear. I told myself it was simply good acting, the natural chemistry that sometimes develops between performers. But even as I constructed these rational explanations, I knew they were insufficient. When I arrived at the church that evening, Julian was already there, sitting in the same section as before, though this time he looked up when I entered. He smiled, not the broad, performative smile people use at church functions, but something smaller, more genuine, something that felt like recognition. The rehearsal began with warm-up exercises, vocal scales, and physical stretches led by Mrs. Patterson with her characteristic blend of patience and authority. But I found myself watching Julian as he moved through the exercises. There was an ease to his movements, a comfort with his own body that seemed almost foreign in this context. While the rest of us maintained the careful boundaries that church settings demanded, Julian somehow managed to inhabit his space fully, without apology. During our scene work, he brought the same intensity as the night before, but now there was something else, a playfulness that danced at the edges of his performance. When Mrs. Patterson asked us to try the scene with different emotional undertones, Julian leaned into the exercise with an enthusiasm that bordered on subversive. He improvised small gestures, subtle variations in his delivery that made our familiar lines feel newly discovered. I found myself responding in ways that surprised me. Where I had always been careful, measured, appropriate, Julian's presence seemed to draw out something more spontaneous. Our exchanges took on a rhythm that felt less like performance and more like conversation, as though we were discovering something together rather than simply reciting predetermined words. The other cast members began to notice. During our break, several people commented on how natural our partnership looked, how believable our friendship appeared on stage. Mrs. Patterson herself mentioned that we seemed to have found a genuine connection, something that would serve the production well. But as I drove home that night, past the same familiar landmarks, through streets that held no surprises, I knew that what was developing between Julian and me had little to do with the Easter play. Something was shifting inside me, some long-dormant part of myself stirring to life after years of careful dormancy. It felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure, like waking up from a dream I had not realized I was dreaming. At home, Evelyn was grading papers at the kitchen table, her red pen moving across student essays with practiced efficiency. Clara was practicing violin in the living room, the same piece she had been working on for weeks, each repetition bringing her closer to mastery. The house hummed with the quiet productivity of our evening routine. I stood in the doorway between kitchen and living room, watching these two people who formed the center of my constructed life, and felt the strangest sensation, as though I were seeing them from a great distance, as though I were already gone. The third rehearsal ended later than usual. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on running through the entire second act twice, adjusting blocking and refining transitions until even the most patient among us began to show signs of fatigue. By 9:30, most of the cast had gathered their scripts and jackets, exchanging tired goodbyes and reminders about the following week's schedule. I was folding my script, preparing to join the general exodus, when I noticed Julian still seated in the front row. He was not packing up like the rest of us, but instead sat quietly, reading through his lines with the same focused attention I had observed during our first encounter. The basement was emptying around him, but he seemed in no hurry to leave. I hesitated near the back wall, uncertain whether to approach or simply slip out unnoticed. But something about his stillness drew me forward, as though he were waiting for exactly this moment when the room would be ours alone. He looked up as I approached, and that same private smile I was beginning to recognize crossed his features. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with their persistent electrical song, casting harsh shadows that somehow made the space feel more intimate rather than less. "We should practice our scene," he said, his voice carrying easily in the now quiet room. "Just us. I think it would feel more real without everyone watching." The suggestion was reasonable enough. We had been partnered for nearly 3 weeks, but always in the context of group rehearsals, surrounded by the controlled chaos of 20 other people learning their parts. It made sense that we might benefit from private practice, the chance to explore our character's relationship without the pressure of an audience. But even as I nodded agreement, I knew that his invitation carried weight beyond practical considerations. There was something in the way he said it, the way he held my gaze while waiting for my response, that suggested we were discussing more than just line memorization. The others finished their conversations and departed, leaving us alone beneath those persistent lights. Julian stood and moved to the center of the taped performance area, and I followed, feeling strangely nervous in a way that had nothing to do with stage fright. We began with our familiar lines, the scripted exchange about faith and fear that we had rehearsed dozens of times. But without the presence of others, something shifted in the dynamic between us. Julian moved closer than the blocking required, close enough that I could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, close enough to catch the scent of his soap, something clean and uncomplicated that reminded me of rain. When he delivered his line about staying awake through the darkest hours, he reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. The gesture was not scripted, but it felt natural, inevitable. His palm was warm through the thin fabric of my shirt, and I found myself leaning slightly into the contact rather than pulling away. We continued through the scene, but the words seemed to take on meanings beyond their religious context. When I spoke about doubt and the struggle to maintain faith, I was no longer thinking about Christ in the garden, but about the growing uncertainty in my own carefully ordered life. When Julian responded with lines about companionship and the importance of not facing darkness alone, his eyes never left mine. The scene concluded, but neither of us stepped back. We stood there in the silence that followed our final lines, the space between us charged with something I could not name, but could no longer ignore. The fluorescent lights continued their electrical hum, and somewhere in the building above us, a door closed with a distant echo. Julian's hand remained on my shoulder, and I became acutely aware of my own heartbeat, of the way my breath seemed to have grown shallow without my conscious intention. This was the moment when a reasonable person would have stepped back, made some comment about the effectiveness of the practice session, begun the process of returning to the safe boundaries of appropriate behavior. Instead, I found myself asking if he thought we were getting better at this pretending to be close friends. The question came out more revealing than I had intended, and Julian's expression shifted in response, as though he heard the subtext beneath my words. "We could meet outside of rehearsal," he said quietly. "Not for the play, just to talk. I think we would understand each other better." The invitation hung in the air between us like a challenge, like a door opening onto territory I had never allowed myself to explore. I knew what the reasonable response should be. I had a wife at home, a daughter who trusted me, a life built on foundations of propriety and restraint. Meeting Julian outside the sanctioned context of church activities would cross lines I had never even considered crossing. But as I stood there, his hand still warm on my shoulder, the basement around us feeling increasingly like a pocket of possibilities separate from the rest of the world, I heard myself saying yes. The word came out quietly, almost whispered, but it seemed to echo in the empty space around us. Julian's smile widened, not the polite expression he wore during group interactions, but something more genuine, more pleased. Something that suggested he had been hoping for exactly this response. We exchanged phone numbers, a simple transaction that felt monumentally significant. He suggested coffee, or perhaps a walk somewhere quiet where we could really talk. I agreed to both, though I was not entirely sure what we would find to discuss beyond our shared involvement in the Easter production. But even as I wondered about the specifics, I knew that conversation was not really the point. Something was happening between us, something that existed in the spaces between words, in the way we looked at each other when we thought no one else was watching, in the careful way we had both begun to navigate the charged territory of our partnership. I drove home through familiar streets that felt somehow different, as though the landscape itself had shifted to accommodate this new possibility I was carrying. The radio played softly, some forgotten song from my youth that I had not heard in years, and I found myself actually listening to the words instead of letting them fade into background noise. At home, Evelyn was reading in bed, her bookmark precisely placed at what appeared to be the three-quarter mark of a novel I had seen her reading for the past week. She looked up when I entered, her expression mildly curious. "You're later than usual," she observed. "Did rehearsal run long tonight?" I paused at the dresser, removing my watch and setting it in its designated place beside my wallet and keys. "Yes," I told her. "We worked on some scenes that needed extra attention." It was not exactly a lie, but it was not exactly the truth either. It was something in between, a careful omission that felt like the first step across a threshold I had not previously known existed. Evelyn nodded and returned to her book, apparently satisfied with my explanation. But as I prepared for bed, following the same routine I had performed for thousands of nights, I knew that everything had changed. I had said yes to Julian's invitation, and in doing so, I had opened a door that I was not sure I would be able to close again. We met the following Tuesday at a coffee shop 3 towns over, far enough from our usual circles to feel safely anonymous. I arrived first, choosing a corner table where I could watch the door while appearing absorbed in a newspaper I had no intention of reading. When Julian entered, scanning the room until his eyes found mine, I felt that same flutter of recognition that had become familiar during our rehearsals. He moved through the space with that easy confidence I had come to associate with him, ordering something complicated at the counter before joining me at the small table. Up close, in daylight filtered through cafe windows, I could see details that the harsh basement lighting had obscured. The way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the small constellation of freckles across his left cheekbone, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, which seemed to happen more frequently when we were alone together. We talked about inconsequential things at first, the Easter production, other members of the cast, Mrs. Patterson's increasingly detailed notes about blocking and delivery. But gradually, as the afternoon stretched on and the coffee shop emptied around us, our conversation drifted into deeper territory. Julian asked about my work, and I found myself describing not just the insurance claims and policy reviews that filled my days, but the strange sense of disconnection I felt from it all. The way I sometimes sat at my desk and wondered how I had ended up processing other people's misfortunes for a living, calculating risk and loss for situations I had never experienced myself. He listened with an attention that felt unprecedented in my experience. Not the polite, distracted listening that characterized most of my social interactions, but something more engaged, more present. When I paused, uncertain whether I was revealing too much about my dissatisfactions, he leaned forward slightly and asked questions that suggested he had been truly hearing what I said. He told me about his own work, freelance graphic design that allowed him to travel, to take on projects that interested him rather than simply ones that paid well. He had moved to our town only 6 months ago, drawn by the lower cost of living and the proximity to the mountains where he liked to hike. The Easter play had been his attempt to meet people, to find some sense of community in a place where he knew no one. But as he talked about his work, his travels, the deliberate choices he had made to prioritize experience over security, I felt a strange ache in my chest. Here was someone who had built a life around possibility rather than obligation, who seemed to move through the world with an intention I had never learned to cultivate. He asked about the books on my shelf at home, and I found myself admitting that I rarely read anymore, despite having once loved literature with a passion that surprised even me to remember. He asked about music, and I told him about the guitar that had been gathering dust in our spare room for the past decade, about songs I used to write in college before practical concerns took precedence. Somewhere in the middle of our conversation, he asked about my dreams, not the sleeping kind, but the ambitious, hopeful variety that people carry when they are young and still believe in the possibility of transformation. I had not thought about those dreams in years, had trained myself to focus on responsibilities and realistic expectations. But sitting across from Julian in that nearly empty coffee shop, I found myself remembering the person I had once imagined I might become. When we finally left, the sun was already beginning to set, painting the parking lot in shades of amber and gold. I realized we had been talking for nearly 4 hours, and it had felt like minutes. Julian walked me to my car, and when we said goodbye, he suggested we do this again soon. I agreed, perhaps too quickly, already anticipating our next conversation. The drive home felt different than usual. Instead of the automatic navigation through familiar streets, I found myself actually seeing the landscape. The way the evening light caught the windows of houses I had passed thousands of times, the careful gardens that neighbors had cultivated, the small signs of life and choice and individual expression that I had somehow stopped noticing years ago. Our subsequent meetings became a regular occurrence. Sometimes coffee, sometimes long walks through parts of town I had never explored despite living there for over a decade. Julian had a way of finding places I had overlooked. A small park tucked behind the elementary school, a used bookstore that stayed open late on weekends, quiet streets lined with older houses that told stories I had never bothered to read. More importantly, he seemed to see parts of me that had been dormant for so long I had forgotten they existed. When I mentioned the guitar, he asked if I still remembered how to play. When I said I was not sure, he suggested I find out. When I talked about the short stories I had written in college, he asked if I still had them, whether I had ever considered returning to writing. These were not revolutionary suggestions, but they felt that way to me. I had become so accustomed to thinking of myself in terms of my current roles, husband, father, insurance adjuster, that I had lost track of the other possibilities that still lived within me. The effect of these conversations began to show itself in our rehearsals. What had started as professional chemistry deepened into something more electric, more authentic. Our scenes together took on a quality that others began to notice. Mrs. Patterson commented repeatedly on how natural our friendship appeared, how believable our concern for each other seemed during the more dramatic moments. But I knew we were no longer acting, not really. When Julian delivered his lines about companionship and faith, he was speaking directly to me, not to the character I was supposed to be playing. When I responded with words about doubt and the struggle to believe, I was talking about my own life, my own growing uncertainty about everything I had once accepted without question. The other cast members began to comment on our partnership. During breaks, several people mentioned how convincing our friendship looked on stage, how we seemed to anticipate each other's movements and responses with unusual precision. Sandra, who played Mary Magdalene, joked that we must be spending a lot of time practicing together outside of rehearsal. She was more correct than she knew, though our practice sessions had evolved beyond script work into something more intimate, more dangerous. We would run through our scenes in Julian's apartment, a cluttered space filled with books and art supplies and the evidence of a life lived with more intention than mine had ever possessed. His coffee table was covered with sketches and design samples, his walls lined with photographs from places he had traveled, books he had actually read. It was during one of these evening sessions, perhaps 3 weeks after our first coffee shop meeting, that the line between performance and reality finally blurred beyond recognition. We were working through our most challenging scene, a moment that required us to portray the deep bond between friends facing an uncertain future. Julian delivered his line about staying together through whatever came next, about not abandoning each other when the situation became difficult. But instead of stepping back as the scene concluded, he remained close, his hand reaching up to rest against my cheek with a gentleness that had nothing to do with our scripted blocking. For a moment that stretched far longer than any pause should have lasted, we simply looked at each other. His thumb brushed across my cheekbone, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. Some barrier that had been in place for so long I had forgotten it was there suddenly dissolving. I should have stepped back, should have made some comment about staying in character, should have returned us to the safe boundaries of our supposed friendship. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, closing my eyes and allowing myself to experience the simple pleasure of being seen, being touched, being wanted in a way that felt entirely new despite being as old as desire itself. When I finally opened my eyes, Julian was still watching me with an expression I could not fully read, but that seemed to contain recognition, patience, and something that might have been hope. Neither of us spoke about what had just happened, but we both knew that we had crossed into territory that could not be unmapped. I drove home that night with my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, my mind racing through what had just occurred and what it might mean. At home, Evelyn was grading papers at the kitchen table, Clara was practicing violin in the living room, and everything appeared exactly as I had left it hours earlier. But I felt like a different person walking through that familiar space, as though I had been away for months rather than a few hours. When Evelyn asked about my evening, I told her we had worked on some challenging scenes that required extra attention. Another careful truth that was also a lie. Another small step away from the life I had built and towards something I could not yet name, but was no longer sure I could resist. The dress rehearsal was scheduled for a Thursday evening, just 10 days before the Easter performance. Mrs. Patterson had insisted that we treat it as the real thing. Full costumes, complete lighting, no stopping for corrections unless absolutely necessary. The basement had been transformed as much as possible, with borrowed spotlights creating pools of warm illumination and sheets hung to suggest the Garden of Gethsemane. I arrived early, as had become my habit, and found Julian already there, adjusting his costume in front of a small mirror someone had propped against the wall. He wore the simple robes we had all been assigned, but somehow he managed to make even the shapeless brown fabric look intentional, natural. When he saw me approaching, he smiled with what seemed like nervous energy. "Tonight feels different," he said quietly, and I knew exactly what he meant. After weeks of rehearsals, of growing comfortable with our blocking and our lines, the dress rehearsal carried a weight of finality. Soon this would all be over. The production, our partnership, our carefully constructed reason for spending time together. The early scenes went smoothly. The cast had found their rhythm, and even the more inexperienced performers seemed to settle into their roles with new confidence. I watched from the sidelines as the familiar story unfolded, noting how different it felt to see it presented with costumes and proper lighting, how the basement had been transformed into something that almost resembled sacred space. Our scene came near the end of the first act. Julian and I took our positions in the designated area that represented the garden, surrounded by a few other disciples who would serve as background figures. The lighting dimmed to suggest nighttime, and Mrs. Patterson called for action with unusual solemnity. We began as we always did, with lines about staying awake, about maintaining faith through the dark hours ahead. But something was different from the start. Julian's voice carried a tremor I had not heard before, a quality that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than performance. When he looked at me, his eyes held an intensity that made the basement lights fade around us. The scene progressed through its familiar beats, but each moment felt charged with significance beyond the religious symbolism we were supposed to be representing. When Julian spoke about not wanting to face what was coming alone, his hand found mine and held it longer than any blocking had ever specified. When I responded with lines about loyalty and companionship, I found myself speaking directly to him rather than to some imagined audience. Then came the moment that would change everything. The script called for a gesture of support, a simple touch on the shoulder, or perhaps a brief embrace to convey the bond between friends. We had rehearsed various versions of this moment, always keeping it appropriately restrained, appropriately safe. But as Julian delivered his final line, something about remembering this night, about carrying the memory of our friendship beyond whatever separation might come, he stepped closer than he ever had before. His hand rose to touch my face, exactly as it had during that evening in his apartment, but this time in front of 20 other people, under lights that illuminated every detail. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and the words that came out were not from our script. He said my name, not my character's name, but mine, and in that single word I heard everything we had been building toward over the past month. Everything we had been dancing around in coffee shops and during late-night conversations, everything that had been growing between us despite my attempts to contain it within the safe boundaries of friendship and artistic collaboration. And then he kissed me. It was not the kind of kiss that could be mistaken for anything else. Not a stage kiss or an accident or a moment of confused blocking. It was deliberate, tender, unmistakably real. His lips were warm and soft, and for the space of several heartbeats, nothing else existed beyond the sensation of finally allowing this thing between us to be acknowledged. The basement around us seemed to hold its breath. I was dimly aware of the other actors, of Mrs. Patterson with her clipboard, of the borrowed spotlights that continued to illuminate our moment of complete vulnerability. But mostly I was aware of Julian, of the way his hand trembled slightly against my cheek, of the way he pulled back just enough to look into my eyes as though asking a question I was not sure I knew how to answer. Mrs. Patterson's laughter broke the spell. "Save that for the after-party," she called out with good-natured amusement, apparently assuming we had gotten carried away with our performance. A few of the other cast members chuckled, and someone made a comment about method acting. But I saw the truth in Julian's expression, and I knew he could see it reflected in mine. This had not been acting. This had been the culmination of everything we had been moving toward, the moment when all our careful pretense finally collapsed under the weight of what we actually felt for each other. The rest of the rehearsal passed in a blur. I went through my remaining scenes automatically, delivering lines I had memorized weeks earlier, while my mind remained fixed on those few seconds when everything had changed. Julian seemed equally distracted, though he managed to maintain his professional composure better than I did. When Mrs. Patterson finally called rap, I gathered my things quickly, desperate to escape the suddenly suffocating atmosphere of the basement. I needed air, space, time to process what had just happened and what it meant for everything I thought I knew about myself. Julian caught up with me in the parking lot, his expression uncertain in the harsh glare of the security lights. "We need to talk," he said quietly, and I nodded, though I was not sure I was ready for whatever conversation was about to follow. But instead of talking, I found myself getting into my car and driving away, leaving Julian standing alone under those lights. I was not running from him, exactly, but from the magnitude of what had just occurred, from the way a single kiss had managed to crack open the careful construction of my entire life. I drove for nearly an hour, taking roads I had never traveled before, passing through neighborhoods where I knew no one and no one knew me. I needed to be anonymous, to exist for a while in a space where I was not defined by my roles as husband, father, or respectable member of the community. Eventually, I pulled into an empty parking lot behind a closed restaurant and sat in the darkness with the engine running. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, and I could feel my heart beating with an intensity that seemed almost dangerous. The truth was undeniable now, had been made manifest in the most public way possible. What I felt for Julian was not friendship, not artistic collaboration, not even the simple attraction I might have been able to rationalize and dismiss. It was love, complex, transformative, terrifying love that had been growing inside me for weeks while I told myself it was something else, something manageable. But more than that, I finally understood that this capacity for feeling had always been inside me, waiting. Julian had not created something new, but had simply awakened something that had been dormant for so long I had forgotten it existed. All those years of careful distance from my own desires, of accepting a life built around obligation rather than passion, had not eliminated the possibility of this kind of connection. They had only delayed it. I sat in that parking lot until well past midnight, trying to reconcile the person I had always believed myself to be with the person who had kissed Julian back, who had felt more alive in those few seconds than in years of careful, appropriate living. When I finally drove home, the house was dark except for the porch light Evelyn always left on for me. I stood in our bedroom doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep with the peaceful expression of someone whose world had not shifted irrevocably in the space of a single evening. Tomorrow I would have to decide what to do with this new knowledge of myself, this understanding that had been forced into the open by Julian's courage and my own inability to resist what we had been building together. But tonight, I simply stood there in the darkness, still feeling the phantom pressure of his lips against mine, still trembling with the recognition of everything I had been denying and everything I could no longer pretend not to want. The days following the dress rehearsal passed with excruciating slowness. I moved through my familiar routines, morning coffee with Evelyn, 8 hours at the insurance office, dinner conversations about Clara's upcoming recital. But everything felt different now, as though I were performing my own life rather than living it. Evelyn noticed first. She had always been observant, attuned to the subtle shifts in mood and behavior that characterized our household. On Saturday morning, as I sat at the kitchen table pretending to read the newspaper while actually replaying Thursday night's kiss for the 100th time, she set down her coffee cup with unusual deliberation. "You've been distant lately," she said, not accusingly, but with the careful tone of someone testing uncertain ground. "Ever since the play rehearsals became more intensive." I looked up from the newspaper, meeting her eyes for the first time in days. She was still beautiful at 39, with the kind of understated elegance that had attracted me when we were both young and certain about what we wanted from life. But now, sitting across from her in our carefully organized kitchen, I felt the weight of the lie I had been living, not just for the past month, but for years. I tried to reassure her that everything was fine, that I was simply tired from the longer rehearsal schedule. But even as I spoke the words, I could hear how hollow they sounded, how unconvincing my attempt at normalcy had become. She watched me as I spoke, her expression growing more serious. When I finished my explanation, she was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the kind of attention that made me feel transparent. "Is there someone else?" she asked finally, her voice steady but quiet. The question hung in the air between us like a challenge I was not prepared to meet. I opened my mouth to deny it, to offer the reassurances that any reasonable husband would provide. But the words would not come. Instead, I sat there in silence, my coffee growing cold in front of me, unable to lie, but equally unable to tell the truth. That silence was its own confession, and we both knew it. Evelyn's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she had received the answer she had been dreading. She did not ask for details, did not demand explanations or ultimatums. She simply nodded once, picked up her coffee cup, and left the room with a dignity that made my chest ache with guilt. The final rehearsal was scheduled for Monday evening, just 4 days before the Easter performance. I arrived determined to maintain professional distance, to treat Julian as nothing more than a fellow cast member with whom I happened to share several scenes. I would be polite but reserved, friendly but not intimate. I would rebuild the boundaries that had been so thoroughly demolished on Thursday night. But the moment I saw him, standing near the costume rack and adjusting his robes with the same careful attention he brought to everything, I knew that my resolution was useless. When he looked up and saw me, his expression was cautious but hopeful, as though he were trying to gauge whether I regretted what had happened between us. I avoided his gaze and took a seat on the opposite side of the room, pulling out my script and pretending to review lines I had memorized weeks earlier. During warm-ups, I participated mechanically, going through the motions without engaging with the energy that usually characterized our group preparations. When Mrs. Patterson called for our scene, I approached the performance area with deliberate professionalism. I delivered my lines exactly as written, maintained appropriate blocking, kept my eyes focused on some point just past Julian's shoulder rather than meeting his gaze directly. I was determined to prove that Thursday night had been an aberration, a moment of confusion that could be contained and forgotten. But Julian saw through my performance immediately. His own delivery became increasingly desperate as he tried to reconnect with the chemistry we had built over weeks of rehearsal. When I remained wooden and distant, he began improvising small gestures, subtle variations that had always drawn me into deeper engagement with our scenes. Nothing worked. I remained resolutely professional, counting the minutes until the rehearsal would end and I could escape back to the safety of my car, my home, my carefully constructed life. The evening finally concluded with Mrs. Patterson's usual notes and reminders about the upcoming performance. I gathered my things quickly, hoping to leave before Julian could approach me. But as I headed toward the exit, I felt his presence behind me, his footsteps matching my pace across the parking lot. "Nathaniel," he called out when we reached my car. "We need to talk about what happened." I turned to face him, noting how the parking lot lights cast shadows across his features, making him look older and more serious than usual. I wanted to tell him that there was nothing to discuss, that Thursday night had been a mistake we both needed to forget. But when I opened my mouth, different words came out entirely. I can't do this, I said quietly. I can't pretend anymore, but I also can't. I can't be what you need me to be. Julian stepped closer, close enough that I could see the mixture of frustration and compassion in his expression. I wasn't acting that night, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't pretend with you anymore. This isn't just about the play, and you know it. The honesty in his voice was devastating. Here was someone willing to acknowledge what we both felt, willing to risk everything for the possibility of something real. While I stood there, paralyzed by the magnitude of what choosing him would mean. Because that was what he was asking, ultimately. Not just for me to admit my feelings, but to act on them. To choose authenticity over safety, passion over propriety, love over the comfortable numbness I had mistaken for contentment for so many years. I thought about Evelyn's question that morning, about the silence that had answered it. I thought about Clara, practicing violin in our living room, trusting that her father was exactly who he appeared to be. I thought about my job, my church, my carefully cultivated reputation as a reliable, unremarkable member of the community. Choosing Julian would mean unraveling all of it. It would mean admitting that the life I had built was not just inadequate, but fundamentally dishonest. It would mean facing the judgment of everyone who had known me as a certain kind of person, the kind who did not abandon his family for forbidden love, who did not shatter his daughter's understanding of the world, who did not become the subject of whispered conversations and disappointed glances. But standing there in that parking lot, looking into Julian's eyes and seeing reflected there all the possibility I had been denying myself for decades, I realized that the alternative was its own kind of death. I could return to my marriage, my job, my safe routines, but I would be carrying the knowledge of what I had rejected, what I had been too afraid to reach for. I could continue existing in the carefully constructed replica of a life I had built, but I would never again be able to forget that it was just that. A replica, a performance, a way of avoiding the terrifying and necessary work of actually living. Julian waited patiently while I wrestled with this impossible choice, his expression understanding but unwavering. He was not going to make this easier for me by withdrawing his offer, by pretending that what existed between us was anything less than transformative. The church parking lot was empty except for our 2 cars, the basement windows glowing with the warm light of the janitor finishing his evening routine. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the sound seemed to come from another world entirely. I stood there, feeling as though I were balanced on the edge of a cliff, knowing that whatever choice I made would send me tumbling in a direction from which there would be no return. Behind me lay the safe, familiar territory of my constructed life. Ahead lay uncertainty, risk, the possibility of devastating loss alongside the promise of something I had never allowed myself to imagine. Julian's hand reached out tentatively, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. I looked down at it, noting the calluses from his design work, the way his fingers trembled slightly in the cool evening air. Such a simple gesture, but I knew that taking his hand would be crossing a threshold that would change everything that came after. I did not take Julian's hand that night. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, looking down at his outstretched palm, feeling the weight of everything that simple gesture represented. Finally, I stepped back, shaking my head with something that might have been regret or might have been relief. I need time, I told him, my voice barely audible in the quiet parking lot. I need to think about what this means. Julian nodded, though I could see the disappointment in his expression. He lowered his hand slowly, but his eyes never left mine. I understand, he said quietly, but don't take too long. Some things, once you recognize them, don't wait forever to be claimed. I drove home through streets that felt both familiar and foreign, my mind cycling through the same impossible calculations I had been wrestling with for days. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light Evelyn always left burning for my return. Inside, the silence was complete. Evelyn was already asleep, her book closed on the nightstand, her breathing deep and regular. Clara's door was closed, the soft glow from her nightlight creating a thin line of illumination beneath it. Everything was exactly as I had left it hours earlier, but I felt like an intruder in my own home. The Easter performance came and went in a blur of costumes and lights, and congratulatory embraces from audience members who praised our realistic portrayal of friendship and faith. Julian and I maintained professional distance throughout, delivering our lines with mechanical precision while carefully avoiding anything that might resurrect the electricity that had once characterized our scenes together. Afterward, at the reception in the church fellowship hall, people complimented our chemistry, remarked on how natural our partnership had looked on stage. Mrs. Patterson made a point of thanking us both for bringing such authenticity to our roles. I smiled and nodded and accepted the praise while feeling hollow inside, as though I were watching someone else receive credit for a performance I could no longer remember giving. Julian left early, offering polite goodbyes to the cast and crew, but avoiding any extended conversation with me. I watched him go, noting the careful way he moved through the crowd, the way he did not look back as he pushed through the fellowship hall doors into the night. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of routine, one built around the careful management of regret and the exhausting work of pretending that nothing fundamental had shifted in my understanding of myself. I returned to my job with renewed focus, threw myself into Clara's violin recital preparations, made plans with Evelyn for a summer vacation we had been discussing for months. But the pretense was harder to maintain now that I knew what I was pretending. Every morning, I looked in the bathroom mirror and saw someone who had chosen safety over truth, comfort over courage. Every evening, I sat at the dinner table listening to Clara's stories about school and Evelyn's plans for the garden, and felt the weight of what I was not saying, what I would never say. 3 weeks after the Easter performance, on a Tuesday evening when the rehearsal schedule would have brought us together, I found myself standing in our kitchen after everyone had gone to bed. The house was completely still, shadows stretching long across the familiar surfaces. The refrigerator hummed quietly, and somewhere upstairs, a floorboard settled with a soft creak. I stood at the counter where I had eaten breakfast that morning, where I had helped Clara with her homework countless evenings, where Evelyn and I had planned our life together one careful decision at a time. My hands rested on the cool surface, and I became aware of the weight of my wedding ring, the way it had worn a permanent groove in my finger over 15 years of marriage. Slowly, deliberately, I twisted the ring and pulled it off. The action felt both monumental and insignificant, like crossing a line I had not known existed until this moment. I set it gently on the counter next to my keys and wallet, objects that had occupied the same space every night for years. For a long moment, I simply looked at it. This small circle of gold that represented promises made when I was young and certain about what I wanted from life, when I believed that love was something that could be willed into existence rather than discovered, claimed, courageously chosen despite the cost. The pale band of skin where the ring had rested looked naked, vulnerable, foreign. I flexed my fingers, noting how strange my hand appeared without its familiar weight, how different it felt to exist without that constant reminder of who I was supposed to be. My phone vibrated once against the silence, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. I pulled it from my pocket and saw a message from Julian, the first communication I had received from him since the night in the parking lot when I had been too afraid to take his offered hand. The message was simple, just 3 words. I'll wait. I stared at the screen for a long time, reading those words over and over until they seemed to lose all meaning and then regain it in ways that made my chest tight with something that felt like hope mixed with terror. Julian was offering me time, patience, the space to find my way to the choice that I already knew, deep down, I had been moving toward since that first rehearsal in the church basement. I did not reply immediately. I was not ready yet, not quite. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly, as though something that had been constricted in my chest had finally begun to loosen. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, really breathed, perhaps for the first time in decades. The air felt different somehow, full of possibility rather than obligation, carrying the scent of spring through the kitchen window that I had not realized I had left open. When I opened my eyes, my gaze fell on the two objects resting side by side on the counter. The wedding ring that represented the life I had constructed, and my empty hand, finally ready to reach for something I had spent years learning to want, years finding the courage to claim. I left both objects where they were and walked upstairs to bed, carrying with me the quiet certainty that tomorrow, or perhaps the day after that, I would finally know what it meant to choose authenticity over safety, to risk everything for the possibility of living a life that felt genuinely mine.